This week, we are beginning the fifth and final book of the Torah, Sefer Devarim, or Deuteronomy. It begins, "These are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan." I would like to spend some time discussing the importance of words, Devarim, in Jewish thought and in our lives. And our guide through this exploration will be Moses. Let's learn about and from Moses' evolving relationship with words and speech over his life. This book we're entering is almost entirely composed of Moses' speeches to the people of Israel at the end of his life, before he dies and they enter the promised land without him. But if we remember back to the beginning of his journey, we might be surprised that he is filling a book with his speeches. When God first called Moshe to lead the Israelites to freedom at the burning bush, Moshe objected, "Please, O my Lord, I've never been a man of words, either in times past or now that you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Rabbi Yehuda Loew, the Maharal of 16th century Prague, wonders how it can be that the great Moses, whom God chooses as a mouthpiece, is challenged in his ability to speak. To answer the question, the Maharal quotes a Midrash, which says, "Every fetus in the womb has a candle lit over its head, and it can see from one end of the world to the other, and there the fetus is taught all the Torah. When it's born into the air of the world, an angel comes and smacks the fetus below the mouth, and then the fetus forgets everything it has learned." One way people tell this story, that you may have heard, is that the angel touches the newborn on the lip, and that is the origin of the little dimple right under your nose. But Rabbi Loew instead says that the blow from the angel and the language of the Midrash is more violent than a gentle tap. That blow from the angel is where the whole opening of the mouth comes from. In order to have a mouth and be able to speak, says Rabbi Loew, we must forget the totality of Torah. This may sound esoteric, but I believe it's also very relatable. Have you had the experience when your internal thoughts and feelings are deep and true, and the moment you open your mouth to express them to someone else, your thoughts and feelings become garbled and mistaken? By attempting to articulate something true, you lose it and destroy its truth. In a little bit, we will talk about another way you might experience language and truth. But first, how does this story answer our question about Moses? Rabbi Loew says that Moses was like one who had never been hit by the angel. Moses was in an elevated state of pure spirituality, lacking a mouth that erases the Torah and connects you to the lower materiality of the world. Moses has a perfection in relation to God, but he is an incomplete human being because he does not communicate with other humans. As contemporary scholar Aviva Zornberg expounds on the Maharal's reading, a trauma of loss and mourning initiates speaking life. For Moses, the entry into language represents an acceptance of structures and conventions that will narrow his inner world. It requires a choice to join the human world. Moses' journey goes from hearing God at the burning bush and refusing to speak, to standing before a young nation and articulating an entire book beside the Jordan River. That journey is one of sacrificing internal clarity and expansiveness of thought in exchange for relationship, connection with, and influence on other people. Moses' transition is achieved through opening his mouth against his hesitation and engaging with language, with words, Devarim. Elsewhere, Dr. Zornberg says the aim of communication is not to eliminate the stammer, the interference, the rumble of the world. What God wants of Moses is precisely his stammering voice as the very ground of communication. We may hesitate to speak before we can never fully express ourselves, because we will stammer because we might hurt someone, because it won't come out right. But that imperfection in our speech is the core of communication, and therefore the flaws in our words are the human truth that allows us to relate to one another. In the words of Leonard Cohen, "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And yet this call to embrace imperfection for the sake of connection is only part of the story. Another lesson we must learn from Moses' journey through language is the importance of caution in our use of language. Still back at the burning bush, God offers Moses 3 signs to bring to Egypt with him to prove that God sent him. The first is his staff turning into a snake and back again, and the third is Nile River, while transforming into blood. Those 2 miracles are familiar from later in the narrative, from the story we tell on Pesach. The second sign, in between the snake and the blood, is that God instructs Moses to put his hand into his clothes and at his chest. And when Moses takes his hand back out, his hand is white and snowy from the skin condition sa'arat. The sages of the Talmud and later commentators explain that this was not just a sign of God's power, but also a punishment for Moshe. Sarat is generally understood to be a punishment for Lashon Hara, for speaking ill of other people. And when Moses was trying to resist God's call, he said, "But they will not trust me and will not hearken to my voice. Indeed, they will say, 'God has not been seen by you.'" Moses may have thought he was being humble about his own abilities to convey the message, but in fact, he was speaking ill of the whole people of Israel by casting doubt on their faith in God. This Lashon Hara, evil speech that Moses spoke against the people, warranted punishment of leprosy. Much later, Moses finds himself on the other side of Lashon Hara, when his brother and sister speak against him in the wilderness. At that time, Miriam, Moses' sister, is afflicted with sarat for the transgression and has to stay outside the camp until she heals. The Talmud teaches us in Tractate Erechim, third-hand speech kills 3. It kills the one who tells it, the one who receives it, and the one about whom it is said. And in Pirkei Avot, Shimon, the son of Rabban Gamliel, cautions, "All my days I grew up among the sages, and I have found nothing better for a person than silence. Whoever indulges in too many words brings about sin." And Rabbi Akiva teaches that silence is offense to wisdom. But the figure most closely associated with matters of guarding one's tongue is the influential legal and ethical thinker, Rabbi Israel Meir Kagan of Lithuania, around the time of the 20th century. Known as the Chafetz Chaim after one of his books, he developed a legal system around the values of being cautious with one's speech. In the introduction to one of his works on the subject, he writes, "Lashon Hara is more likely to result in the troubles of one's soul than anything else. For Lashon Hara undermines the soul's completion, which is called the soul of man, by virtue of its power of speech, as Rashi teaches in Parshat Bereshit. And this is what is meant by that which is written, 'One who guards their mouth and tongue guards themselves from trouble.'" It's not difficult to see in our contemporary world how language can cause trouble not only in the private, spiritual, and interpersonal realms, but also in the public stage of socio-political discourse. The spreading of third-hand speech can kill more than 3 in the modern media landscape. Misinformation, manipulation, propaganda, and simplistic sloganeering threaten vulnerable populations and hold humanity back from making informed decisions for the betterment of the world. But just as we must be careful about language because it has the power to hurt and destroy, so too we must use our power of language to create, repair, and lift up. The book of Proverbs teaches, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." And a little further down on the same page of Tractate Erechim that we just encountered, Rava explains this verse to mean, "If you seek death, it is through the tongue, and if you seek life, it is also through the tongue." And in the moment Miriam is afflicted with sarat in the wilderness, Aaron uses language to appeal to Moshe, and Moshe uses his language to appeal to God for her healing. And after the call at the burning bush, in spite of Moses' doubts, he and Aaron go to Pharaoh again and again to speak truth to power. Signs and wonders are a part of the process, but always accompanied with speech. Moses' words, "Let my people go," have echoed through the generations and have remained an inspiration in many subsequent fights for liberation. Besides being a liberator, Moses is also the greatest prophet. 20th century theologian Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel has pointed out that perhaps counter to contemporary sensibilities, the highest prophecies were verbal ones. Ecstatic visions came to dominate only later as prophecy decayed and became inferior, even by some accounts, after the end of the proper prophetic age. If Americans say seeing is believing, the Jewish tradition, in contrast, trusts words heard more than sights seen. Similarly, Professor Susan Handelman, a contemporary literary scholar, has laid out an argument that Greek philosophy and rabbinic thought disagree on this point about the importance of language. A core tenet of the Greek Hellenistic Western tradition is that language is merely a tool, and a fundamentally flawed tool, for pointing towards something else, a meaning which is beyond and more important than the language. But in the rabbinic tradition, language is itself fundamental, worthy, and primordial. Handelman writes, despite his differences with Plato, Aristotle agrees that the realm of words is not the realm of meaning and truth. Like Plato, for Aristotle, the central act of knowing is a movement beyond discourse, beyond talking. According to this view, words are merely there to refer to objects in the real world, or even more so, to classes of objects and to abstract concepts. On the other hand, the Torah tells how God created the world using words. God spoke the world into being from the start, saying, "Let there be light." And the rabbis teach that the Torah preceded the world, that God looked into the Torah to create the world, not the other way around. The Hebrew word for words, Devarim, that we began with, is also the way you would translate things. There's no distinction between the two concepts in Hebrew. Professor Handelman writes, the rabbinic world is, to use a contemporary word, one of intertextuality. Texts echo, interact, and interpenetrate. The elements of the text are treated as much as objective reality for its students as empirical facts are by scientific observers. This difference in approach explains why rabbinic methods of argumentation, from linguistic details and coincidences, often seem strained or illogical to us. They follow from a different underlying assumption about the value and role of language than the one we learn from the Western tradition. The Jewish focus on language as the object of study spans vastly different realms of our tradition, from the legal argumentation of the halakha to the expansive narrative creativity of Agadah, to the careful explanatory commentary of Parshanut. Even our mystical teachings, which we might expect would attempt to transcend language in ecstatic experience, are in fact hyper-focused on words, the words of Torah, and even arbitrary permutations of letters. 20th century scholar Professor Gershom Scholem writes about how Kabbalism is different from Christian and Muslim mysticism, saying that Kabbalism is distinguished by an attitude towards language, which is quite unusually positive. Kabbalists who differ in almost everything else are at one in regarding language as something more precious than an inadequate instrument for contact between human beings. To them, Hebrew, the holy language, is not simply a means of expressing certain thoughts, born out of a certain convention, and having a purely conventional character in accordance with the theory of language dominant in the Middle Ages. Language, according to the Kabbalists, reflects the fundamental spiritual nature of the world. In other words, it has a mystical value. Not only in the realms of intellectual and spiritual leadership, but also in traditional practices of the whole Jewish population, language plays an outsized role. Prayer is our primary spiritual activity, both personal and communal. We could be meditating or dancing or even bringing offerings, and it is a notable choice that we bring ourselves nearer to God by going somewhere and talking for hours. In the words of the prophet Hosea, take words with you and return to God. Say, forgive all guilt and accept what is good. Instead of bulls, we will pay the offering of our lips. We sanctify our consumption of food and beverage by uttering brachot, blessings, in the form of words, and similarly sanctify our witnessing of natural phenomena, our performing of mitzvot, even our passing through time, all with blessings made of words. Jewish folk superstitions are full of words, from ancient amulets inscribed with written formulations to little phrases that season our contemporary speech. We create and dissolve marriages and personal obligations by speech acts. Words have real meaning and real consequences, both spiritual and practical. They really do things. At the center of this deep involvement with language stands Moses. the bringer of the written Torah and the beginning of the oral Torah. Moses, who pleaded with God, "I have never been a man of words," and went on to declare the book of Deuteronomy. And in between those moments, he was an intermediary between God and the people, primarily through language. The number of times the phrase, "and God spoke to Moses saying," appears in the Torah is perhaps approached only by the number of times we read the phrase, "Moses said to the children of Israel." As we enter into the book of Deuteronomy, Sefer Devarim, the book of words, words which are also things, words which are divine and human, words which can create and destroy worlds, let us hear the invitation to maintain the holiness of language. Intentionality around language can be our greatest Jewish resistance to assimilation in foreign values. We have a deep Jewish tradition and ethos around spiritual immersion in language and sensitivity to words. We must keep aware of their power and stay very cautious with their destructive capabilities and choose to use the power of language in constructive ways and to moral redemptive ends. Shabbat Shalom.